We all have a life story, don't we? It's, the narrative we tell ourselves, maybe what we put on our resume, a CV, education, jobs, milestones.
Right, that neat little summary.
Yeah. But have you ever stopped, like really stopped to think about how that story isn't just yours? How it's deeply shaped, structured,
Mm.
maybe even messed with, de-standardized by the society we live in?
It's so true. We often think, oh, these are my choices, my path, but there are these sort of invisible scripts running in the background, aren't there?
Exactly. And that's what this deep dive is all about, the life course. We're not just looking at your individual journey. We want to unpack how society structures things, standardizes them.
And then, fascinatingly, how things start to unravel or de-standardize.
Right. We'll dig into some history, maybe some surprising origins of things like childhood or retirement, and we'll look at how researchers actually, figure this complex stuff out.
Yeah, we've got a great mix of sources today, some academic work, German life history studies, global perspectives on aging, social theory, quite a range.
So our goal, really, is to help you see your own story maybe a bit differently.
Yeah.
Understand how it fits into bigger patterns and what that might mean for, well, for your own decisions, your view of the world.
Okay, so where do we start? This whole idea of a life course. Is it just like natural, or did we make it up?
Well, think about that CV again. It looks pretty standard usually.
Mm-hmm. Education, then work.
Right. It implies these shared ideas, these sociocultural norms about how life should go, like finish school by X age, get a job, and that kind of thing.
But here's where it gets really interesting. That standardization, that everyday understanding, it's a social construct.
Okay, unpack that.
Age itself, we
Yeah.
think of it as just counting years,
Yeah.
right? Biological, but it's also a social category, massively social.
How so?
Okay, look back at history. These things called life staircases from the 16th century, pictures showing life as like going up a staircase, then down the other side.
Ascent and descent. Got it.
But what's weird is they often didn't really have a distinct childhood or youth phase like we do.
Yeah. Really? So what was there instead?
Sometimes they'd assign animals to different ages to symbolize, certain behaviors or qualities society expected.
Like what?
Well, you might see a phrase like 40 years well done. That's not about biology. It's a social judgment, an attribution of wisdom or something.
Huh. And childhood itself.
That idea, childhood as this separate, protected, institutionalized phase, that really only came about much later, maybe second half of the 18th century onwards.
Wow. And I remember reading about gender differences too.
Oh, definitely. Around 1900, you see these life staircases specifically for men and women, and their paths diverge sharply, especially after starting a family.
And that split wasn't biological either, was it?
No, purely social roles, social expectations. So it means we need to distinguish between different kinds of age. There's chronological years, biological physical state, psychological, how old you feel, and then, crucially, social age. The roles society expects you to play at different times. Early ethnographers saw age was used everywhere to order society, but they also saw how differently it was constructed across cultures and times.
It really hammers home how constructed it is when you look at cultures like the Tuareg.
Right. They traditionally don't count years. If you ask someone their age.
It might just say 30 or 100 to
Yeah.
satisfy you. Right.
Right.
Because the number isn't the point for them.
Exactly. Their life course is marked by events, by roles. Things like goat herding time, entering the garden, going on caravan. It's about what you do, not how many years you've clocked.
And even in Europe, knowing your exact age wasn't common until, what, the 19th century?
Pretty much. Societies weren't really built around strict age grades or age norms back then, which makes you wonder, how did we get to this highly standardized, normal life course we often take for granted?
Yeah, what needed to happen for that? Let's talk about that golden age of standardization.
Well, the absolute foundation before anything else was demographic, a huge shift in, death.
Morbid, but important.
Very. Historically, death was pretty random. Infant mortality, child mortality, incredibly high. You mentioned Germany in the 1870s, a quarter of babies dying before age 1.
Hard to imagine. You couldn't really plan a life course if survival itself was so uncertain.
Exactly. The big change was that deaths started becoming concentrated much later in life, in old age. Demographers call it the rectangularization of the survival curve.
It sounds technical, but it basically means life became more predictable.
Fundamentally predictable. For the first time, you could reasonably expect to live a long life. And that made a socially structured, individually plannable life course possible.
Okay, so survival got predictable. Then came the structure, this Fordist life course regime, you called it,
Mhm.
particularly in West Germany, say 1950s to 70s.
Yeah, think Ford assembly line, but for life stages. Very standardized, especially for men.
What did that look like for men?
A really clear three-part structure. Education, then work, then retirement, usually vocational training for 3, 4 years, then bam, straight into a stable full-time job.
Secure jobs.
Very secure, good prospects for moving up, unemployment was rare. This whole setup made it easy, expected even, to marry young and start a family.
But the story for women was quite different.
Oh, completely. Women's lives were still very much centered on the family. Yes, they were getting more education, but most interrupted their careers when the first child arrived. Maybe they'd go back later, often part-time, maybe to a different kind of job. Financial dependence was common.
And it wasn't socially acceptable for mothers with young kids to work.
Generally, no, not outside the home.
And family timing. Marriage, kids.
Happened pretty early. Women often in their early to mid-20s. 2 kids was the standard model.
And retirement. Also
So, yeah,
standardized.
usually 65 for men, 60 for women, though there was a pension reform in 72 that allowed earlier retirement for people with long contribution records.
So this normal life course became a real benchmark, didn't it? It shaped everything.
Absolutely. Social expectations, company policies, organizations literally planned around the assumption that women would take more time off for kids. It was a very rigid template.
So if that was the peak of standardization, this golden age, you could call it,
Yeah.
did it last? Or were things already starting to shift?
Oh, the cracks were definitely showing. Even from the late 60s, early 70s, you started seeing big shifts in values.
Like what?
More emphasis on individual autonomy, self-realization. People started delaying marriage, delaying having kids, non-marital relationships, divorce rates,
Yeah.
all started rising.
And education played a role, too. You mentioned waiting halls.
Yeah, it's a bit of a paradox. More people getting more education, which is good, right?
Yeah.
But it also meant pushing back entry into the full-time workforce.
Right.
Then you had the women's movement, a huge force pushing for education and careers for women, independent of just getting married and having kids.
And economic factors.
Definitely. Economic shocks, like the 73 oil crisis, made that transition from school to work bumpier, longer for a lot of people.
But here's the twist, right? All this happened while the welfare state was often expanding and incomes were generally rising.
Exactly. It's this weird mix. Young adults actually had more resources, more freedom in a way, to spend longer in education, try out different living situations, pursue their own goals before settling down.
Leading to ideas like the postponed generation or patchwork biographies.
Precisely. Suddenly, that neat Fordist template didn't fit so many people anymore. You look at your own life path, or maybe your LinkedIn profile. It looks very different from your parents' or grandparents' likely path.
So do we see this de-standardization in the data? Like in those big German studies you mentioned?
We do, but it's nuanced. If you look at the school to work part,
Education, training, first job.
right, the changes across generations, say from those born in the 1920s to the 1971 cohort, are relatively small, pretty consistent. Yes, education took longer for later cohorts.
But not drastically different paths.
In that area, interestingly, there was even some homogenization. Men's and women's paths actually became more similar in terms of education levels and joining the workforce.
Okay, so where did the big changes happen?
Family formation, that's where things really diverged from the old model.
How so?
Well, for instance, the age people first set up their own independent household. It actually went down for younger generations, from late 20s maybe down to early 20s.
So it wasn't tied to getting married or having a stable job anymore.
Exactly. Those things got decoupled. Moving out happened earlier, but marriage ages started climbing again for younger cohorts.
Gotcha. Any stats on that?
Yeah, pretty striking ones. For men born in 1971, only 17% were married by age 27. Compare that to men born in 1940, 64% were married by the same age.
Wow, that's a huge difference.
Massive. And the timing of marriage, of having the first child, it just became much more varied, less predictable. The range of ages widened significantly, especially for women born after 1950, and for younger men too. You get these much flatter curves when you plot marriage age.
So this unraveling, this de-standardization,
Mm.
it's not happening the same way for everyone, is it?
Absolutely not. It varies a lot by social group. Think university graduates versus people with just secondary school, skilled workers versus unskilled. Different groups experience these shifts differently.
And globally. This whole idea of a normal Western life course with childhood, work, retirement, That's a luxury for many, isn't it?
A huge luxury. You
Right.
mentioned child labor figures earlier, 168 million kids working back in 2012. For them, the concept of a protected childhood phase just doesn't exist in the same way.
It's a stark reminder of different realities. And sometimes, even within affluent societies, very different and quite negative, trajectories can become almost normal for certain groups.
Yeah, that's a disturbing point. When things like, say, incarceration becomes so common for a specific demographic that it's almost an expected detour, a normal starting point in their life course.
You gave that example of black men in the U.S. in the late 90s.
Right. For those in their mid-30s, then, having a prison record was nearly twice as common as having a bachelor's degree. That shows how social disadvantage can literally structure a vastly different and often damaging life path.
So normal is really, really dependent on context.
Yeah.
But you also said de-standardization can lead to re-standardization, new norms emerging.
Yes, exactly. It's not just chaos. New patterns emerge, like
Uh,
living together before marriage, non-marital cohabitation. That's become a pretty standard first step into partnership for many young people now, even as marriage itself gets delayed.
So patterns shift. They don't just disappear. Okay, let's switch gears slightly.
Right.
How do researchers actually study all this? How do they do the deep dive?
One key tool is the cohort approach.
Looking at groups born around the same time?
Exactly. The idea is that your birth cohort shares certain historical experiences during formative years, and that leaves a kind of imprint.
Makes sense.
But it's tricky. Researchers wrestle with what's called the APC problem: age, period, cohort. It's hard to separate whether a change you observe is because people are getting older,
Wow.
age effect, or because something specific happened in history that affected everyone at that time, period effect, like a war or a pandemic, or if it's unique to that generation's experiences, cohort effect.
So trying to pinpoint the cause of change is complicated. Are people different because they're 50 now? Because they lived through the 70s oil crisis? Or because they're baby boomers?
Precisely. And often these things are tangled together in real life. You can't usually separate them perfectly just with statistics.
Sounds like a headache.
Yeah.
But they have other tools, right? You mentioned longitudinal data.
Ah, yes. That's incredibly powerful. Following the same individuals over many, many years.
Like that German life history study.
Exactly. Tracking thousands of lives born across different decades. It lets you see how individual lives actually unfold against the backdrop of social change. Or another study tracked East German graduates right through reunification.
Wow, talk about a major historical shift impacting lives.
You can really see how their careers were thrown onto new tracks by that sudden system change. Longitudinal data gives you that dynamic picture.
So if we boil it down, what are the core ideas, the key principles researchers use when they think about life courses? You mentioned four.
Right. Four big ones. First, historical time and place. Where and when you live profoundly shapes your path. Obvious, maybe, but crucial.
Okay, number two.
Timing. When something happens in your life matters hugely. Experiencing something like the Great Depression as a young child has different long-term effects than experiencing it as an adult about to retire.
Right, the impact depends on your life stage. Makes sense. Third.
Human agency. This is important. Structures matter. Yes, society shapes things. But individuals aren't just puppets. We make choices, we act, we navigate the opportunities and constraints we face.
So our personality, our drive, our choices still count.
Absolutely. Things like motivation, how you solve problems, whether you take risks, that's all part of how you actively construct your own life within the given context.
And the last one, linked lives.
Linked lives. Your life isn't lived in isolation. It's connected to others, family, friends, colleagues. Social changes, historical events, they ripple through these networks.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about a teenager becoming a parent. That event doesn't just change their life course, it instantly changes their parents' lives too. They might become grandparents much earlier than expected, impacting their own plans or roles.
Or how having strong social connections can help someone cope with losing a job.
Exactly. Those links provide support, resources, buffering against negative shocks. Our lives are interwoven.
Okay, so those are the big principles. And researchers use specific terms to analyze the path itself, right? Trajectories, transitions.
Yeah, it helps to break it down.
Yeah.
Think of trajectories as the long-term pathways or sequences in different parts of life. Your career trajectory, your family trajectory, they have continuity, a direction.
Like a river flowing.
Kind of. Then transitions are more like specific events, short-term changes in status or role, starting a job, leaving school, becoming a parent, getting divorced. They mark movement along or between trajectories.
Crossing a bridge on the river.
Good analogy. They can be sudden, like being widowed in an accident, or more of a process, like the path leading up to a divorce.
And the last one, turning points.
Ah, those are the really significant shifts. Moments where one trajectory kind of ends and a new one begins. Maybe a big decision, an unexpected event, something that fundamentally redirects your path.
Like hitting a dam and the river changes course completely.
Exactly. And often we only recognize these turning points when we look back, when we tell our own life story. They help us make sense of our journey, give it coherence.
So these concepts, trajectories, transitions, turning points,
Yeah.
they help map out the complexity of individual lives within those bigger social forces we've been talking about.
Precisely. It gives a framework for understanding your own story, not just as a series of random events, but as part of a larger dynamic process.
Okay, so wrapping this up, we've journeyed from seeing the life course as maybe fixed or natural to understanding it as deeply social. We looked at historical ideas about age.
The rise of that standardized Fordist model with its clear paths.
And then the more recent unraveling, the de-standardization, the rise of more individualized, maybe more precarious paths we see today.
And it really brings home that your life story is this constant dance between social structures, the opportunities, the constraints, the norms, and your own agency, your choices, your actions.
Yeah. It's not one or the other, it's the interplay. Now, for a final thought, something for you, the listener, to mull over.
We touched on this idea of intergenerational justice.
Right. The thought that perhaps older generations, the welfare state generations, benefited from a period of high stability, good pensions, secure jobs.
A system that might be less generous or less predictable for younger post-welfare state generations coming through now. You mentioned the German pension example earlier. Cohorts got great returns for low contributions.
While younger people face more uncertainty, maybe higher contributions for potentially lower benefits down the line.
It raises a really critical question, doesn't it? In this world where life courses are becoming so much more diverse, less predictable, more individualized,
How can societies make sure things are fair? How do we support everyone, no matter which cohort they belong to or what kind of path they end up taking?
what would a truly fair, truly equitable life course structure even look like today for you, for future generations?
It's a huge challenge. And understanding these deep social forces shaping our lives, the stuff we've talked about today, that's got to be the first step towards figuring it out.